I watched my sister collapse dramatically in the hospital corridor, clutching her chest as nurses rushed to her aid. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was in my crisp nursing uniform, holding the bottle of her heart medication that I'd just refilled with actual placebos. Sarah had no idea that for the past 6 months, she'd been taking real beta blockers while faking a condition she didn't have. Now that I'd switched them back to sugar pills, her body was experiencing withdrawal from medication she never needed, creating the very symptoms she'd been pretending to have all along. The satisfied smile playing at my lips probably wasn't appropriate for a medical professional, but after 23 years of watching Sarah manipulate our entire family with her elaborate medical charades, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. This moment had been years in the making, a carefully orchestrated symphony of justice that was finally reaching its crescendo. Code Blue, Cardiac Unit, Room 247, the overhead announcement crackled through the hospital speakers. Sarah's room. I quickened my pace, not out of concern for my sister's well-being, but to ensure I had a front row seat for the final act of her downfall. The hallway erupted into controlled chaos as the code team rushed past me. Dr. Martinez, Sarah's cardiologist, was already barking orders as they wheeled her toward the emergency bay. Her face was pale, genuinely pale for perhaps the first time in her adult life, and her breathing was labored in a way that couldn't be faked. The beta blocker withdrawal was hitting her system hard, creating the very cardiac distress she'd been performing for the past 3 years. As I followed the commotion, my mind drifted back to how this all began. The roots of my revenge stretched back decades, to a childhood spent in the shadow of Sarah's manufactured illnesses and the injustices that followed. It all started when Sarah was 14 and I was 11. She'd discovered, quite by accident, that fainting in gym class brought immediate attention, concerned teachers, and a trip to the nurse's office that got her out of a math test she hadn't studied for. What began as a moment of opportunistic deception quickly evolved into something far more sinister. Sarah was brilliant. I had to give her that. She approached medical manipulation with the same methodical precision that our parents applied to their surgical procedures. She researched symptoms meticulously, memorized diagnostic criteria, and learned to time her episodes for maximum impact and minimal risk of detection. By high school, she'd convinced our parents that she suffered from a rare autoimmune condition called Sjogren's syndrome. The diagnosis came with a parade of specialists, expensive treatments, and a complete restructuring of our household around her supposed needs. Sarah, who had always been the golden child with her perfect grades and charming personality, now had the added advantage of being the tragic victim of an unfair disease. I watched from the sidelines as our family's entire dynamic shifted to accommodate Sarah's fictional illness. Family vacations were planned around her fatigue cycles. Social events were canceled when she had flare-ups. Most painfully, family resources, both financial and emotional, were increasingly directed toward Sarah's care. Our parents, Dr. Rebecca Chen and Dr. James Chen, were both successful physicians at St. Mary's Hospital. Mom was a neurologist, Dad a general surgeon, and they brought home comfortable six-figure salaries that should have provided security for both their daughters. Instead, Sarah's mounting medical expenses began to strain even their substantial income. The specialist alone cost thousands. Dr. Williams, the rheumatologist who diagnosed Sarah's supposed Sjogren's syndrome, charged $400 per visit, and Sarah convinced him she needed monthly monitoring. Dr. Peterson, the ophthalmologist who treated her dry eyes, prescribed expensive artificial tears and specialized contact lenses. Dr. Foster, the dentist who addressed her dry mouth, recommended costly procedures and custom-made oral appliances. None of it was covered entirely by insurance. Experimental treatments, out-of-network specialists, and cutting-edge therapies that Sarah researched and requested added up to tens of thousands of dollars annually. Money that should have been saved for college funds, family emergencies, or retirement was instead flowing towards Sarah's elaborate medical theater. Meanwhile, I was expected to be the healthy child who required nothing. While Sarah received gentle encouragement and modified expectations for everything from chores to academic performance, I was held to increasingly demanding standards. "You have to understand," Mom would say, stroking Sarah's hair as she lay dramatically across the couch during another fatigue episode. "Your sister can't help being sick. We need you to be strong for the family." Strong for the family meant doing Sarah's chores when she was too tired. It meant accepting that family trips would be canceled because Sarah couldn't travel during a flare up. It meant watching my parents spend hours researching treatments for her condition, while barely acknowledging my straight A report cards or my acceptance to the state science fair. The resentment built slowly, like sediment accumulating at the bottom of a lake. I loved my sister, or at least I loved the person I thought she was, but I couldn't understand why she always seemed to recover just in time for things she wanted to do, only to relapse when faced with responsibilities or expectations she preferred to avoid. When Sarah was 17 and I was 14, she escalated her performance to a new level. She convinced our parents that her Sjogren's syndrome was progressing rapidly and that she needed experimental treatment at a specialized clinic in Switzerland. The cost was staggering, $80,000 for a 6-week program that promised revolutionary results. To pay for it, our parents liquidated my college fund. Emma will understand, Dad had said during a family meeting where Sarah sat pale and fragile looking in her carefully chosen oversized sweater. This is a matter of life and death for your sister. You're smart and capable. You'll find a way to pay for college. Sarah might not live to see graduation without this treatment. The injustice of it burned in my chest like acid. I'd been saving money from part-time jobs since I was 12, adding to the college fund our grandparents had started for me. Watching years of careful planning and sacrifice disappear to fund Sarah's latest dramatic production felt like a physical assault, but the real betrayal came 6 months later when Sarah returned from Switzerland with glowing reports of her improvement and immediately began planning her senior year activities. She joined the drama club, started dating the captain of the basketball team, and threw herself into college applications with the energy of someone in perfect health. The experimental treatment had apparently been miraculous. Sarah's fatigue disappeared, her dry eyes cleared up, and her overall health improved dramatically. She was accepted to Northwestern University with a full scholarship. Not a medical scholarship for disabled students, but an academic scholarship based on her excellent grades and extracurricular activities. I watched this transformation with growing suspicion. If Sarah had truly been as sick as she'd claimed, how could she recover so completely and so quickly? If the Swiss treatment had been so effective, why wasn't she continuing the protocols that had supposedly saved her life? The answer came to me gradually, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. Sarah hadn't been cured because she'd never been sick. The Switzerland trip had been an elaborate vacation funded by my stolen college money, complete with enough medical-sounding documentation to satisfy our trusting parents. My suspicions were confirmed during Sarah's freshman year at Northwestern. She pledged a sorority, maintained a full course load, and partied with the stamina of someone in peak physical condition. Her social media was filled with photos of late-night adventures, athletic activities, and general college debauchery that would have been impossible for someone with a chronic autoimmune condition. Yet whenever she came home for holidays, Sarah would mysteriously develop flare-ups that required bed rest and careful attention from our parents. She'd arrive at the airport looking healthy and vibrant, then gradually develop symptoms over the course of her first day home. By dinner, she'd be pale and listless, complaining of fatigue and joint pain that would last exactly as long as her visit. I started documenting these patterns, keeping a careful record of Sarah's symptoms and their suspicious timing. She was never sick during finals week, job interviews, or social events she wanted to attend. Her flare-ups coincided perfectly with family obligations she wanted to avoid, academic challenges she wasn't prepared for, or financial needs she wanted our parents to address. By my junior year of high school, I'd compiled a comprehensive dossier of Sarah's deception. But I was 17 years old, and my parents were respected physicians who trusted their older daughter implicitly. When I tried to present my evidence, they dismissed it as sibling jealousy and misunderstanding of chronic illness. Autoimmune conditions are complex, Mom had explained patiently, as if I were a child who couldn't grasp basic medical concepts. Patients often feel better when they're in low-stress environments, and worse when they're dealing with family dynamics or familiar triggers. Sarah's improvement at school just shows that the treatment is working. The frustration of being dismissed and disbelieved pushed me toward a decision that would change the trajectory of my entire life. If I wanted to expose Sarah's deception, I needed medical credentials that would give my observations credibility. I needed to understand the healthcare system from the inside, to learn how medical fraud was perpetrated and detected. I applied to nursing school with a singular focus that surprised my guidance counselors. While my classmates were exploring various career options, I was laser focused on medical education with a specialization in cardiac care. If Sarah was going to continue manipulating the healthcare system, I wanted to be positioned to stop her. The irony wasn't lost on me that Sarah's theft of my college fund had actually redirected me toward a career that would eventually enable her downfall. I worked 3 jobs to pay for nursing school, spending my days in classes and my nights waiting tables, cleaning offices, and tutoring younger students. The financial stress was crushing, but it was also motivating. Every late night shift was fuel for the fire of my eventual revenge. Nursing school was revelation after revelation. I learned about factitious disorders, malingering, and the sophisticated ways that patients could manipulate medical systems. I studied the diagnostic criteria for the conditions Sarah had claimed to have, and I became increasingly convinced that her performances had been carefully researched fraud rather than legitimate illness. More importantly, I learned about the real impact of medical fraud on healthcare systems and other patients. Every dollar wasted on unnecessary treatments for fakers like Sarah was a dollar that couldn't be spent on legitimate patients who desperately needed care. Every specialist appointment Sarah monopolized was an appointment that couldn't be given to someone with genuine medical needs. The moral dimensions of her deception became clearer as I worked with real patients, suffering from the conditions Sarah had appropriated for her performances. I watched elderly patients with actual Sjogren's syndrome struggle with genuine symptoms that Sarah had mimicked for attention. I saw families bankrupting themselves to pay for legitimate treatments, while Sarah had casually stolen similar amounts for her elaborate vacations. But it was during my clinical rotations that I discovered Sarah had graduated to an even more sophisticated level of medical manipulation. She'd moved beyond the relatively harmless autoimmune charade of her college years and was now claiming to have a serious cardiac condition. I learned about this development during a family dinner in my senior year of nursing school. Sarah, now 25, and working as a marketing coordinator at a tech startup, had arrived looking pale and dramatically fragile. She'd been having episodes, she explained, where her heart would race uncontrollably and she'd experience chest pain and shortness of breath. The cardiologist thinks it might be arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy, she said, using the medical terminology with the practiced ease of someone who'd memorized it carefully. It's a rare condition that can cause sudden cardiac death in young adults. We're doing more testing, but Dr. Martinez is concerned. Dr. Martinez. Even the name sent a chill down my spine. Dr. Richard Martinez was one of the most respected cardiologists at St. Mary's Hospital, the same institution where our parents worked and where I hoped to begin my nursing career. If Sarah was manipulating him, she was playing in the major leagues of medical deception. Our parents' reaction was predictably dramatic. Mom immediately began researching ARVC, pulling up journal articles and consulting with cardiology colleagues. Dad started making calls to get Sarah appointments with the best specialists in the region. The family dynamic that I'd hoped had improved during Sarah's college years snapped right back into crisis mode. "We'll get you the best care available," Dad promised, holding Sarah's hand as she sat dramatically in her chair, occasionally pressing her palm to her chest as if feeling irregular heartbeats. Money is no object when it comes to your health. I bit my tongue to keep from screaming. Money was no object for Sarah's health, but it had been a very real object when it came to my education. The double standard was so blatant it was almost comical, except that I was the one who'd suffered the consequences. That night, I made a decision that would define the next phase of my life. I was going to expose Sarah's cardiac charade, but I was going to do it properly this time. Instead of compiling evidence as an outsider, I was going to position myself as an insider with access to her medical records and treatment protocols. I applied for a position in the cardiac unit at St. Mary's Hospital immediately after graduation. The application process was competitive, but my excellent grades and glowing recommendations from clinical instructors helped me secure the position. When the hiring manager asked why I was specifically interested in cardiac nursing, I gave them a carefully prepared answer about wanting to help families dealing with heart disease, neglecting to mention that the family I most wanted to help was my own, and the help I had in mind was exposing a fraud. My first year as a cardiac nurse was intensive training in both the medical and administrative aspects of heart care. I learned to read EKGs, monitor cardiac rhythms, administer heart medications, and recognize the signs of genuine cardiac distress. More importantly, for my long term plans, I learned how the hospital's record keeping systems worked, how medications were tracked and dispensed, and how patient information was stored and accessed. I also learned that Dr. Martinez was indeed treating Sarah for a supposed cardiac condition, and that her case was considered unusual and concerning. Her symptoms were inconsistent with typical patterns, her test results were ambiguous, and her responses to treatment were unpredictable. Dr. Martinez had admitted to colleagues that he was puzzled by her case and was considering referring her to a specialist at the Mayo Clinic. The fact that Sarah was baffling one of the region's best cardiologists was both impressive and infuriating. She'd clearly refined her technique since the autoimmune fraud of her college years. Her cardiac performance was sophisticated enough to fool a specialist, which meant she'd done extensive research and was probably using more advanced methods to create convincing symptoms. It took me 6 months of careful observation and strategic positioning before I was assigned as one of Sarah's regular nurses during her monthly cardiology appointments. The hospital rotated nursing assignments to prevent conflicts of interest and ensure fresh perspectives on patient care, but I'd learned to work the system through shift swaps and schedule requests. The first time I walked into Sarah's appointment as her assigned nurse, her surprise was genuine. We hadn't seen each other in several months, and she clearly hadn't expected to encounter me in a professional capacity at her doctor's office. "Emma!" she exclaimed, her performance of delighted surprise absolutely convincing. "I had no idea you worked here. What a wonderful coincidence." "Dr. Martinez, this is my little sister. She's a nurse." Dr. Martinez had smiled warmly, clearly pleased by what appeared to be a heartwarming family connection. "How wonderful, Sarah. You never mentioned you had a sister in healthcare. Emma, it's a pleasure to meet you. Sarah is one of our most interesting cases. We're working hard to manage her arrhythmia." "I specifically requested the cardiac unit," I'd said, playing my role perfectly. "I wanted to understand heart conditions better, maybe help other families going through what ours has experienced." Sarah's eyes had gleamed with satisfaction. Even in her supposed vulnerability, she couldn't resist the opportunity to be the center of attention. The brave patient with the devoted sister who'd chosen her career path out of concern for her condition. What followed were months of careful observation and documentation. I gained access to Sarah's complete medical records through legitimate nursing duties, and I studied every test result, every symptom report, and every treatment protocol. What I found was a masterpiece of medical manipulation that was far more sophisticated than her previous frauds. Sarah had learned to game the system at a level that was almost impressive. She'd researched cardiac conditions extensively, focusing on ARVC, because it was rare enough that most doctors had limited experience with it and because its symptoms were subjective enough to be difficult to verify objectively. The brilliance of her chosen condition was that ARVC often presents with intermittent symptoms that can be hard to capture on standard testing. Patients might have normal EKGs between episodes, making the condition challenging to diagnose definitively. Sarah had positioned herself perfectly in the gray area between clearly diseased and obviously healthy that made doctors err on the side of caution. But I was beginning to see the patterns that Dr. Martinez was missing. Sarah's episodes always occurred at convenient times, never during important work presentations or social events, but frequently before medical appointments or family gatherings where she wanted sympathy and attention. Her symptoms were always dramatic enough to be concerning but never severe enough to require emergency intervention. More tellingly, her responses to medication were suspicious. Dr. Martinez had prescribed beta blockers to help control her supposed arrhythmias, but Sarah's reported improvement was inconsistent with the medication's expected effects. Sometimes she claimed the drugs helped dramatically, other times she insisted they made her symptoms worse, often depending on what kind of attention she was seeking. That's when I realized Sarah was probably manipulating her medication regimen to create symptoms on demand. Beta blockers work by slowing heart rate and reducing blood pressure. If someone took extra doses before a medical appointment, they could create symptoms like fatigue and dizziness that would concern a cardiologist. If they skipped doses for several days, then took a large amount, they could trigger rebound hypertension and irregular heartbeats. The medication manipulation theory explained everything: the inconsistent symptoms, the puzzling test results, and the unpredictable responses to treatment. Sarah wasn't just passively faking symptoms, she was actively creating them through careful pharmaceutical manipulation. But proving this would require more than observation and theory. I needed evidence, and getting that evidence would require me to take risks that went far beyond anything I'd contemplated before. The opportunity came when Sarah mentioned during a family dinner that she was planning something special for her upcoming engagement. She'd been dating Marcus Webb, a brilliant cardiothoracic surgery fellow at the hospital, for 8 months. Marcus was everything Sarah typically looked for in a partner: successful, wealthy, and completely devoted to her well-being. Marcus is going to propose soon, she'd confided, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. He's been so worried about my condition, and I think he wants to make sure we're engaged before anything happens to me. The cynicism of using her fake medical condition to manipulate a marriage proposal was breathtaking, even for Sarah. Marcus was a genuinely caring person who'd spent countless hours researching ARVC and consulting with specialists about Sarah's care. He'd rearranged his demanding fellowship schedule to accommodate her medical appointments and had been investigating experimental treatments that might help her condition. "I'm planning a special dinner for the family when he proposes," Sarah continued. "I want everyone there to share the moment. It'll be perfect, assuming I'm having a good day with my heart." The mention of timing her symptoms around the engagement dinner gave me the final piece of the puzzle I needed. Sarah was planning to have one of her episodes during the proposal, probably to generate maximum sympathy and to reinforce Marcus's perception of her as tragically fragile. It would be the perfect culmination of her performance, designed to cement his protective instincts and ensure he'd continue supporting her through whatever fictional medical crises she planned for their marriage. But it would also be the perfect opportunity for me to spring the trap I'd been planning for months. I'd spent weeks researching Sarah's medication regimen and had identified the perfect method for exposing her fraud. The beta blockers she'd been prescribed were creating a state of physical dependence in her system. If someone had been taking them regularly for months and then suddenly stopped, their body would experience withdrawal symptoms that included exactly the cardiac issues she'd been pretending to have: racing heart, irregular rhythms, chest pain, and shortness of breath. The beautiful irony was that Sarah's fake condition could be made temporarily real by withdrawing the medication she'd been using to manipulate her symptoms. If I could replace her beta blockers with identical-looking placebos, her body would go into withdrawal and create genuine cardiac distress that would be impossible for her to control or moderate. More importantly, the withdrawal symptoms would be severe enough to require emergency medical care, which would trigger a comprehensive cardiac workup. When that workup revealed a heart that was structurally and functionally normal, it would raise serious questions about her entire medical history. The medication switch would have to be done carefully and gradually to avoid creating dangerous withdrawal symptoms. Beta blocker withdrawal could be life-threatening if done too abruptly, and despite my anger towards Sarah, I didn't want to actually harm her. I wanted to expose her fraud, not put her in genuine medical danger. I spent weeks perfecting my plan. Working night shifts in the hospital pharmacy gave me access to pill-making equipment and pharmaceutical supplies. I created perfect replicas of Sarah's metoprolol tablets, same size, shape, color, and markings, but filled with lactose instead of the active medication. The gradual substitution began 3 weeks before Sarah's planned engagement dinner. I replaced only a few pills at first, mixed with real medication to ease the transition. Sarah was so confident in her deception and so focused on her performance schedule that she barely paid attention to her actual physical responses. As the percentage of placebo pills increased, I monitored Sarah carefully during her regular appointments. Her blood pressure readings began to climb slightly, and her resting heart rate increased. But the changes were subtle enough to be attributed to stress or normal variation. By the week of the engagement dinner, Sarah was taking pure placebos while believing she was still on her cardiac medication. Her body was beginning to experience withdrawal, creating the very symptoms she'd been faking for months. The irony was perfect. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah was experiencing genuine medical distress, and she had no idea what was happening to her. The night of the engagement dinner, I'd arrived early to help with preparations and to observe Sarah's condition. She looked genuinely unwell for the first time I could remember: pale, slightly shaky, and clearly uncomfortable in a way that couldn't be performed. Are you feeling all right? I'd asked, playing the concerned sister role that had become second nature. Just nervous about tonight? She'd replied, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. Her body was betraying her in ways she couldn't control or understand, creating symptoms that felt different from her usual calculated performances. The dinner had started beautifully. Our parents were in their element, discussing their latest research projects, while Marcus shared stories from his surgical training. Sarah had been glowing with anticipation, clearly planning for her moment of romantic triumph. But as the evening progressed, her genuine withdrawal symptoms began to intensify. What she'd planned as a carefully controlled episode during dessert became an uncontrollable medical crisis that she couldn't moderate or stop. Marcus had proposed during the main course, producing his grandmother's vintage engagement ring, with a speech about wanting to marry Sarah, despite the uncertainty of her medical condition. It should have been her moment of complete victory, the culmination of months of manipulation designed to secure his devotion and financial support. Instead, Sarah's acceptance had been interrupted by genuine cardiac symptoms that she couldn't turn off or adjust for dramatic effect. Her heart rate was genuinely irregular, her breathing was actually labored, and her distress was real in a way that was completely unfamiliar to her. Sarah? Marcus had stood immediately, his medical training taking precedence over the romantic moment. What's wrong? Your pulse is racing. The beautiful part was watching our parents' reaction. After years of Sarah's performances, they clearly assumed this was another calculated episode timed for maximum impact. Even Marcus, despite his concern, seemed frustrated by the timing. Let's get you to the hospital, he'd said, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The proposal had been planned for months, and Sarah's sudden medical crisis seemed suspiciously convenient. No, Sarah had gasped, and for the first time, her resistance to medical care seemed genuine, rather than performative. She was scared by symptoms she couldn't control and didn't understand. I just need to rest. But this time, she actually needed medical attention. Her withdrawal symptoms were creating genuine cardiac distress that required intervention, not just attention and sympathy. The ambulance ride to St. Mary's had been surreal. I'd insisted on accompanying Sarah, maintaining my role as the concerned sister, while internally marveling at the perfect justice of watching her experience real medical distress for the first time. The ER had taken her symptoms seriously because they were finally real. Her heart rate was dangerously elevated, her blood pressure was spiking, and her cardiac rhythm was genuinely irregular in ways that couldn't be faked. Dr. Martinez had been called in immediately, his expression grave as he reviewed her presenting symptoms. This is the most severe episode we've seen, he'd told Marcus and our parents. We need to run a comprehensive cardiac workup immediately. What they found was fascinating and revealing. Sarah's heart was structurally perfect, no signs of ARVC, no evidence of any cardiomyopathy, no indication of chronic disease. But her system was in obvious distress, creating dangerous symptoms that had no underlying cardiac cause. It's almost like withdrawal, Dr. Martinez had mused to the attending physician. But she's been compliant with her beta blocker regimen. That's when I'd made my crucial intervention. During a quiet moment when Sarah was sedated and the medical team was reviewing her case, I'd approached Dr. Martinez with a carefully crafted observation. Doctor, I'd said hesitantly, playing the concerned family member perfectly. I'm worried that Sarah might not have been taking her medication as prescribed. I've noticed some inconsistencies in her pill counts when I've helped her organize her weekly medications. The suggestion had been subtle but effective. Dr. Martinez ordered an immediate review of Sarah's medication adherence, including blood tests to check for therapeutic levels of metoprolol in her system. The results were damning. Sarah's blood work showed no trace of beta blockers despite her claims of perfect medication compliance. Her withdrawal symptoms suddenly made perfect sense. She was experiencing rebound hypertension and cardiac irregularities from stopping medication her body had become dependent on. But why would she stop taking prescribed medication for a serious heart condition? The question led to a broader investigation into Sarah's medical history and behavior patterns. That's when the real revelations began. Dr. Martinez, puzzled by the medication noncompliance and the lack of structural heart disease, had consulted with Dr. Rebecca Chen, a psychiatrist who specialized in factitious disorders. Dr. Chen had reviewed Sarah's case with the fresh perspective of someone who understood medical manipulation. This is a textbook case of Munchausen syndrome, Dr. Chen had explained to our family during a carefully orchestrated meeting. The patient fabricates or induces illness to gain medical attention and sympathy. It's more sophisticated than most people realize. The psychiatric evaluation that followed was devastating for Sarah and revelatory for everyone else. Years of carefully constructed medical lies began to unravel under professional scrutiny. Dr. Chen had seen cases like this before and knew exactly what patterns to look for. Sarah's medical records were reviewed comprehensively, going back to her teenage claims of autoimmune disease. Inconsistencies that individual doctors had dismissed or overlooked became obvious when viewed as a pattern. Symptoms that appeared and disappeared based on circumstances rather than disease progression. Test results that never quite supported the severity of her reported symptoms. Most damning was the financial investigation that followed. Medical fraud cases automatically triggered insurance audits, and Sarah's case was no exception. What they found was a complex web of deception that went far beyond simple attention-seeking behavior. Sarah hadn't just been faking illness for sympathy. She'd been monetizing her medical fraud in sophisticated ways. Insurance reimbursements for her fake treatments had been deposited into personal accounts rather than paying providers. She'd been claiming disability benefits for conditions she didn't have. Most shocking of all, she'd been stealing from family members under the guise of medical expenses. The investigation revealed that my stolen college fund was just the beginning. Sarah had been systematically draining our family's resources for years, using her fake medical needs as justification for increasingly large financial requests. She'd convinced our grandparents to modify their wills, arguing that a sick grandchild needed more inheritance than a healthy one. She'd taken out loans in our parents' names, claiming the money was for medical treatments that never actually occurred. The total theft was staggering, over $800,000 in fraudulent medical expenses, stolen inheritance money, and diverted family resources. Sarah had essentially been running a family-focused Ponzi scheme, using her fake illnesses to justify taking money that was then diverted to fund her lifestyle. Our parents were devastated not just by the financial loss, but by the realization that they'd been manipulated for years by their own daughter. The grief was complex. They were mourning not just the money they'd lost, but the daughter they'd thought they'd known. Marcus had been perhaps the most heartbroken. His proposal had been motivated by genuine love and a desire to support Sarah through what he'd believed was a serious medical condition. Learning that their entire relationship had been built on elaborate deception was traumatic in ways that went beyond simple betrayal. The legal consequences had been swift and comprehensive. Medical fraud, insurance fraud, elder abuse, identity theft. The charges accumulated as investigators dug deeper into Sarah's activities. Her sophisticated understanding of medical systems that had made her such a convincing patient also made her case particularly egregious in the eyes of prosecutors. She'd been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with restitution orders that would follow her for the rest of her life. The judge had been particularly harsh, noting that Sarah's crimes had not only defrauded institutions, but had also caused genuine harm to family members and potentially diverted resources from legitimate patients. As for my role in exposing her fraud, the medication tampering that had triggered the investigation, it had been cleverly covered by the revelation of her psychiatric disorder. The official story was that Sarah had been manipulating her own medication as part of her factitious behavior, creating real symptoms to make her fake condition more convincing. Hospital security footage that might have shown me accessing her medication had been conveniently corrupted during a system upgrade, and my access to pharmaceutical supplies was explained by my legitimate duties as a cardiac nurse. The investigation had concluded that Sarah's withdrawal symptoms were self-induced, part of her psychological need to create genuine medical crises. Now, 18 months after Sarah's conviction, I was standing outside the conference room where I was about to be promoted to nurse manager of the cardiac unit. The position came with a substantial salary increase, administrative responsibilities, and most importantly, oversight of protocols designed to prevent medical fraud. My case study of Sarah's deception had been published in the Journal of Medical Ethics and was being used to train healthcare professionals in recognizing factitious disorders. I'd become a sought after consultant for hospitals dealing with suspected medical fraud, and my expertise was helping protect the healthcare system from predators like my sister. The financial restitution process had recovered most of our family's stolen money, with interest and penalties that actually left us better off than we would have been originally. My college loans were paid off, and I had enough remaining to start planning for medical school, a dream that was now achievable thanks to the very fraud that had once seemed to destroy it. Our parents had slowly begun to heal from the trauma of Sarah's betrayal. They'd entered family therapy and were working to rebuild their relationship with truth and trust. The experience had made them more cautious about medical claims, but also more appreciative of genuine family connections. Marcus had taken a position at a hospital in Seattle, needing distance from the memories and associations with Sarah's deception. He'd sent me a letter before leaving, thanking me for my support during the investigation and praising my intuitive understanding of cardiac care. "You have incredible instincts for spotting medical inconsistencies," he'd written. "Sarah was fortunate to have a sister who cared enough to ensure she got the help she really needed, even when that help wasn't what anyone expected." If only he knew how right he was about my instincts, and how carefully I'd orchestrated the help Sarah had received. The prison letters from Sarah arrived monthly, carefully crafted attempts at manipulation that showed she still hadn't fully accepted responsibility for her actions. She wrote about finding God, about understanding her mental illness, about wanting to make amends with the family she'd hurt. But between the lines of appropriate remorse, I could still see the calculating mind that had orchestrated years of sophisticated fraud. Sarah was performing repentance the same way she'd performed illness, with careful attention to her audience and strategic deployment of emotional manipulation. I read her letters carefully before filing them away with the rest of her medical records. After all, I was now an expert in recognizing performance art disguised as genuine medical or emotional need. The most satisfying aspect of my victory wasn't the money recovered or even Sarah's imprisonment. It was the knowledge that I'd used her own methods against her with surgical precision. She'd spent years manipulating medical knowledge to create fake symptoms and generate false sympathy. I'd used deeper medical expertise to create real symptoms that exposed her lies and generated genuine justice. The student had become the master, and the lesson had been comprehensive. My new office overlooked the cardiac unit where I'd first begun documenting Sarah's deception. Every day, I could see the room where she'd been treated during her final fraudulent episode, the place where her carefully constructed lies had finally collapsed under the weight of genuine medical scrutiny. More importantly, I was now positioned to protect other families from medical predators like Sarah. My expertise in factitious disorders had already helped identify 3 other cases of medical fraud in our hospital system. Each case prevented meant resources saved for legitimate patients and families protected from the kind of manipulation mine had endured. The work was deeply satisfying in ways that went beyond professional achievement or personal revenge. Every fraud I prevented, every resource I protected, every family I saved from manipulation, it all felt like a continuation of the justice Sarah had finally received. But perhaps the most poetic aspect of my victory was that Sarah had actually prepared me perfectly for this career. Her years of medical manipulation had given me an education in the intersection of psychology, medicine, and deception that no nursing school could have provided. I could spot factitious disorders, malingering, and medical fraud with an accuracy that amazed my colleagues and terrified potential fraudsters. I'd become the perfect predator for catching medical predators because I'd been raised and trained by one. My computer chimed with an alert about a new admission to the cardiac unit. Jennifer Martinez, age 28, presenting with chest pain and a complicated medical history that included multiple hospital visits across 3 states. According to her records, she'd been diagnosed with various cardiac conditions by different physicians, but her test results were inconsistent, and her symptoms didn't follow typical patterns. I smiled as I reviewed her file. After Sarah, cases like this were almost insultingly easy to identify. The warning signs were obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. The geographic spread of medical care designed to prevent doctors from comparing notes, the vague symptoms that couldn't be objectively verified, the dramatic presentations that somehow never resulted in clear diagnoses. But they were also opportunities to protect the medical system from fraud and ensure that resources went to patients who genuinely needed them. Each faker I caught was a victory, not just for justice, but for every legitimate patient who would receive better care, because resources weren't being wasted on elaborate charades. I gathered my files and headed toward Jennifer's room, already planning the careful questions and observations that would expose her deception. The work ahead was challenging but deeply satisfying. A perfect fusion of my medical training, my hard won expertise in fraud detection, and my personal understanding of the psychological dynamics that drove people to manipulate medical systems for personal gain. As I walked down the corridor toward Jennifer's room, I reflected on how perfectly my life had aligned with its true purpose. Sarah's years of abuse and manipulation had been terrible to endure, but they'd also forged me into exactly the weapon the healthcare system needed to protect itself from predators like her. Jennifer was lying in bed when I entered, her positioning carefully calculated to suggest fragility without appearing overly dramatic. She was attractive in the way that many successful medical manipulators were, the kind of person who inspired protective instincts and benefited from unconscious bias in their favor. "Hello, Jennifer," I said, settling into the chair beside her bed with my tablet and assessment forms. "I'm Emma, your primary nurse for this shift. I understand you've been having some concerning symptoms. Why don't you tell me exactly what's been happening?" As she launched into her carefully rehearsed presentation of cardiac distress, I listened with the patience of someone who'd heard variations of this performance countless times. Her story had all the hallmarks of sophisticated medical fraud: symptoms that were dramatic but vague, a medical history that was complex but inconsistent, and a presentation style that was designed to generate sympathy while discouraging too many specific questions. "The chest pain started about 6 months ago," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of brave vulnerability. "It's this crushing sensation, like someone's sitting on my chest. My heart races. I can't catch my breath, and sometimes I feel like I'm going to die." Classic angina symptoms, described with textbook precision. But her delivery was too smooth, too practiced. Real patients struggling with genuine cardiac symptoms usually had more difficulty articulating their experiences, more uncertainty about the exact nature of their distress. "Have you noticed any patterns to when these episodes occur?" I asked, making notes on my tablet while carefully observing her body language. "They seem random," she replied quickly, too quickly. "Sometimes they happen when I'm resting, sometimes when I'm active. There's no real trigger that I can identify." Another red flag. Legitimate cardiac symptoms almost always had identifiable triggers or patterns, even if patients weren't initially aware of them. The claim of complete randomness was often a sign that someone was making up symptoms rather than experiencing them. "What about your previous cardiac workups?" I continued. "I see you've been evaluated at several different hospitals. Have any of the tests shown definitive results?" Jennifer's expression became carefully troubled, with just a hint of frustration. "That's been the most frustrating part. All the tests keep coming back normal, but I know something's wrong. The doctors keep saying my heart looks fine, but I can feel that it isn't." The classic presentation of factitious disorder: dramatic symptoms that couldn't be objectively verified, normal test results that the patient dismissed as inadequate, and an insistence that medical professionals were missing something obvious. I spent the next hour conducting a thorough assessment, asking detailed questions about her symptoms, medical history, and current medications. With each answer, my certainty grew that Jennifer was following the same playbook Sarah had used: sophisticated medical fraud designed to generate attention, sympathy, and probably financial benefits. But unlike Sarah's case, where I'd been motivated by personal revenge, my approach to Jennifer was purely professional. I had no emotional investment in her downfall. I simply wanted to protect the healthcare system from fraud and ensure that legitimate patients received the resources they needed. Over the next several days, I documented Jennifer's behavior patterns with clinical precision. Her cardiac episodes followed suspicious timing, occurring primarily during shift changes when medical staff were distracted or late at night when fewer physicians were available to conduct detailed evaluations. More tellingly, her symptoms seemed to respond to attention rather than medication. When nurses spent time at her bedside, her distress appeared to diminish. When medical staff were busy with other patients, her episodes became more frequent and dramatic. I also noticed inconsistencies in her reported symptoms. During one episode, she claimed severe chest pain, but her vital signs remained stable and she showed no signs of genuine distress. During another, she reported shortness of breath while speaking in complete sentences without any apparent respiratory difficulty. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Jennifer was manipulating her own cardiac monitoring equipment. Modern hospital monitors are sophisticated devices that track heart rhythm, blood pressure, and oxygen saturation continuously, but they can be fooled by patients who understand their operation. Working a night shift when Jennifer thought she was unobserved, I caught her subtly adjusting her monitoring leads to create false readings. By partially disconnecting the electrodes, she could generate abnormal rhythms on the monitor that would trigger alarms and bring medical staff running. It was a clever technique that required some medical knowledge to execute effectively, but it was also definitive proof of deliberate deception that I documented carefully with both written observations and photographic evidence. The confrontation came during a family meeting that included Jennifer, her concerned parents, and Dr. Martinez, who'd been called in to consult on her case. I'd prepared my evidence carefully, organizing it into a clear presentation that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. "We've completed our evaluation of Jennifer's cardiac symptoms," Dr. Martinez began, his expression serious but puzzled. "Her test results continue to be normal, which is puzzling given the severity of her reported symptoms." Jennifer's parents looked appropriately concerned, clearly believing their daughter was suffering from a mysterious condition that doctors were failing to diagnose. I felt a pang of sympathy for them. They were victims of Jennifer's deception, just as my parents had been victims of Sarah's. "However," Dr. Martinez continued, "we've discovered some concerning inconsistencies in Jennifer's presentation that suggest her symptoms may not have a cardiac origin." I stepped forward with my documentation, presenting the evidence of monitor manipulation in clear, professional terms. The photographs were undeniable. They showed Jennifer deliberately creating false readings on equipment designed to detect genuine medical emergencies. The reaction was swift and devastating. Jennifer's confident performance crumbled as she realized her deception had been discovered. Her parents were shocked and confused, struggling to understand how their daughter could have fabricated something so serious. "Why would you do this?" her mother asked, tears streaming down her face. "We've been so worried. We've spent thousands on medical bills." Jennifer's explanation was a familiar mixture of psychological justification and continued manipulation. She claimed to have been seeking help for anxiety and depression, insisting that her fake cardiac symptoms were a cry for attention rather than deliberate fraud. But the investigation that followed revealed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond simple attention-seeking. Like Sarah, Jennifer had been monetizing her medical deception through insurance fraud, disability claims, and financial manipulation of family members. The case was referred to hospital security, law enforcement, and insurance fraud investigators. Jennifer was discharged immediately and faced charges similar to those that had sent Sarah to prison. For me, the successful identification and prosecution of Jennifer's fraud felt like validation of my life's work. I'd prevented her from continuing to abuse the healthcare system and had protected other potential victims from her manipulation. But more importantly, the case had established my reputation as an expert in medical fraud detection. Other hospitals began consulting with me on suspicious cases. Medical schools invited me to lecture on factitious disorders, and insurance companies sought my expertise in investigating questionable claims. 6 months later, I received news that would have seemed impossible during the dark years of Sarah's abuse. I had been accepted to medical school with a full scholarship based on my published research in medical fraud detection. The scholarship was funded by a foundation dedicated to improving healthcare integrity, an organization that specifically sought to support professionals who demonstrated expertise in protecting medical resources from abuse. My acceptance letter had noted that my unique background and proven ability to identify medical deception made me an ideal candidate for their program. I would be studying to become a physician with a specialization in internal medicine and a focus on healthcare fraud prevention. The irony was perfect. Sarah's theft of my original college fund had led me to nursing school, where I'd developed the expertise to expose her fraud. That expertise had now earned me a medical school scholarship that was more valuable than the money she'd stolen. I was going to become Dr. Emma Chen, a physician whose career would be dedicated to protecting the healthcare system from predators like my sister. The day I received my acceptance letter, I sat down to write Sarah one final letter. She was now 3 years into her 12-year sentence, and her monthly correspondence had become increasingly desperate as she realized her family had permanently moved on without her. Dear Sarah, I wrote, I wanted to share some exciting news with you. I've been accepted to medical school with a full scholarship. My research on medical fraud detection has opened doors I never could have imagined when you stole my college fund all those years ago. I've been thinking about how everything comes full circle. Your theft led me to nursing school, where I learned to spot the kind of deception you specialized in. Your fraud led to my expertise in medical manipulation, which has now earned me a scholarship to become a doctor. In a way, you've been the greatest teacher I've ever had. You showed me exactly what kind of person I never wanted to become, and you gave me the skills to recognize and stop people like you. I'll be starting my medical education next fall with a focus on internal medicine and healthcare fraud prevention. By the time you're released from prison, I'll be Dr. Chen, working to protect the medical system from the kind of sophisticated fraud you pioneered. I want you to know that I'm not angry anymore. I'm grateful. Your abuse taught me strength, your theft taught me resourcefulness, and your fraud taught me expertise that has become my life's calling. Every patient I protect from medical predators, every family I save from manipulation, every dollar I preserve for legitimate medical care. It's all part of the justice you set in motion when you chose to steal from me. Thank you for making me exactly the person the world needed me to become. Your sister, Dr. Emma Chen, soon to be. I sealed the letter and placed it in my desk drawer, deciding not to send it after all. Sarah didn't deserve to know about my success, and she certainly didn't deserve credit for teaching me anything positive. Instead, I called our parents to share the news of my acceptance. Their joy was uncomplicated by the complex emotions that still surrounded Sarah's imprisonment. They were proud of my accomplishments and excited about my future in medicine. We always knew you were special, Mom said, her voice warm with genuine affection. Your determination and integrity have been remarkable to watch. You're going to be an excellent physician. Sarah used to be so jealous of your intelligence, Dad added, then stopped himself. We still didn't talk about Sarah much. The wounds were too fresh, and her betrayal had been too comprehensive. I think I understand now why everything happened the way it did, I said carefully. All of it, the theft, the lies, the years of manipulation. It was preparation for what I'm supposed to do with my life. Medical school passed in a blur of intensive studying, clinical rotations, and research projects focused on healthcare fraud. My unique background made me a sought-after collaborator for professors studying factitious disorders and medical deception. During my internal medicine rotation, I encountered several more cases of suspected medical fraud and was able to identify patterns that other physicians missed. My success rate in detecting factitious disorders was unprecedented, leading to publications in major medical journals and speaking invitations at national conferences. By my 4th year, I had already been accepted for a residency program in internal medicine at a prestigious hospital that specifically wanted my expertise in fraud detection. My career path was clear. I would become a physician who specialized in legitimate internal medicine, while also serving as a consultant for cases involving suspected medical deception. The night before my graduation from medical school, I received an unexpected visitor. Marcus Webb had driven down from Seattle, where he'd built a successful cardiothoracic surgery practice, to congratulate me on my achievement. I wanted to see you become Dr. Chen in person, he said, his smile warm, but carrying undertones of complex emotions. After everything that happened with Sarah, watching you succeed has been incredibly meaningful. We talked for hours about medicine, about our careers, and inevitably about the shared trauma of Sarah's deception. Marcus had thrived professionally since leaving the painful memories behind, but he admitted that the experience had changed his approach to relationships and trust. I still can't believe how thoroughly she fooled all of us, he said. If you hadn't been there to piece together what was really happening, she might have continued the fraud indefinitely. She underestimated the one person who understood her methods, I replied. That was her critical mistake. You saved more than just our family's finances, Marcus continued. You prevented her from manipulating other victims and protected the integrity of the medical system. That's a remarkable legacy. As I walked across the stage to receive my medical degree, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Every sacrifice, every challenge, every moment of pain had been preparation for this calling. Dr. Emma Chen was ready to begin her career protecting the vulnerable from medical predators, ensuring that resources went to legitimate patients, and maintaining the integrity of the healthcare system that served society's most basic needs. Sarah still had 7 years left on her prison sentence. By the time she was released, I would be an established physician with a national reputation for excellence in fraud detection. The student who had once been her victim would have become the master of the very system she had tried to exploit. Justice, as it turned out, was not just about punishment for past crimes. It was about transformation, growth, and the creation of something positive from even the most negative experiences. I had become exactly who I was meant to be, and Sarah's attempts to destroy me had ultimately forged me into the perfect instrument of protection for others who might face similar predators. The circle was complete, and the future was bright with possibilities for service, healing, and continued justice.